Struggling to write interesting and impactful verses that keep people listening? Well, keep watching this video because I'm going to break down how you can write amazing verses. Hey, I'm Reagan Ram with OrpheusAudioAcademy.com, helping you make better music and grow your fan base online. And today we're talking all about verses, and specifically we're covering the 3 elements that go into writing verses. And that is number 1, the instrumentation. Number 2, the melody that then sits on top of the instrumentation that we, tend to hear and remember. And then number 3, the lyric content. So we're going to be breaking down how to write each of these to perfection here in this video. But backing up for a second, first of all, what is a verse and what is its purpose in your song? To sum it up, a verse is basically just a section of your song that repeats, and the lyric content tends to change from verse to verse, whereas you'll have a chorus where the lyrics tend to stay the same from chorus to chorus. And the purpose of a verse is to carry the story of your song, whereas the choruses are more so meant to emphasize the message. So verses are story content, choruses are message content. This doesn't mean you can't still have story elements in your choruses and have very interesting imagery in your choruses, but of course, that's a completely different video. We're focusing on verses here. So another way it might help you to think of maybe your chorus is like the sermon or the TED Talk, or however you want to think about, you're receiving valuable information, right? The message of the story, whatever is being kind of emphasized. And then your verses are like a novel, right? So you might not realize this, but every novel has a message that they're trying to get across to you. They're just doing it through story rather than just coming out and preaching to you. At least the good stories, right? A lot of stories, movies, books these days, a lot of them are trying to beat you over the head with messages, and it really sacrifices the story. But that's a completely different subject too. So think of it that way, that your verses are advancing a narrative, and then your choruses are emphasizing the message or the theme of that narrative. So speaking of writing a novel, then, when you're starting to write your verse, you want to start by grounding the listener on what's happening, who it's happening to, where it's happening, and when it's happening. So that's just the way you'd open. The same thing with opening a novel. You want the reader to know within the first few sentences the answers to all those questions. You can do all this within the first couple lines of your first verse. Now, a general point with all songwriting, at least my preference, right? Again, there's no really hard and fast rules for songwriting because everyone has different preferences. But in general, I think it's better when your lyrics aren't so on the nose, meaning you're saying exactly what's going on. So you wouldn't, write a verse like, I am at a grocery store in small town in rural Missouri. Right? You want to use some more interesting language, interesting imagery. You would want to spice it up, make it more interesting, and even add some mystery. All my lyrics, I tend to like to have double meanings too. I'll have, like, on the surface what the song's about, but then the actual everything is a symbol in my lyrics. They tend to represent other things, other emotions or messages or ideas. Where you still want to establish in your first verse, right, what the setting is, what's happening, who is it happening to, when is it happening, and where is it happening at. With, in an interesting way, using, visual, sensory language, language that involves the 5 senses. And then you have different purposes for different verses as well, right? You have the first verse, second verse, maybe a third verse, or even more if you're writing a really long song. But typically you only have 2 to 3 verses in a song. And so you can kind of break it up, again, using the kind of the novel format, which I like to think of songwriting as kind of like writing a super short novel. Is you'll have in a typical novel, right, a typical adventure story. Let's take the 3 verse song format. And so in a typical story, you have 3 acts. You have the first act, the second act, and the third act. And so in the first act, you are basically setting up the story. You're letting people know about who the characters are, what's going on, what's the situation. And then the first act ends when the hero, the main character, decides to embark on the story quest. They decide to go and try and achieve the story goal. And so that might be your first verse, is kind of covering that same kind of element. And again, this doesn't, right, your songs don't have to be big adventure stories. It can be, about very small things. It can be about emotions, but you can take that same concept into writing your verses. And so then verse 2 would be like the second act of your story, where they're, moving closer to their goal, but they're encountering obstacles and setbacks. So they might actually feel like they're getting farther away from the goal as they're trying to progress for it. And then in the third verse or your third act, that's where you kind of have them reach the climax. Now, obviously, you're going to want your chorus to really drive that home, but this might be the moment right before that, or it's, starting the final battle or whatever it is. But, and this could, again, you don't have to be using, a big adventure type lyrics, but this could be, coming to grips with some kind of idea or emotion. This is kind of like the end of the journey that you would have in the final verse. And if you only have 2 verses, you would just kind of cut it in half. This is another way to think about writing a novel, is that you have kind of the first half of your novel where the hero is kind of reacting. They have problems. They're trying to figure things out. They're in this new world. Everything's confusing. And in the second half, it's now they're going on the offensive. They're now taking action. So you might think about it as your first verse is describing the problem or describing what it is they want but don't have. And then you have your second verse, which is what they're doing about that, how they're progressing towards that. Have they gotten it? Have they not gotten it? They're still working towards it. Whatever you want to have, that's kind of just how you think about the different verses in your song. And then as your verses relate to your chorus, right? Your first verse is basically setting up the message. It's illustrating something that is about to come. So it's going to be the story that you then build the message upon. So you see what happens in the first verse, and then the chorus is in the conclusion and the message about what just happened there. And then the same thing, right? You have your second verse that is building on the message. Again, it's giving into more detail about why the message of the chorus is accurate and true. All right, so that's kind of it for big picture verse writing, but now let's get into the nitty gritty of, like, say, instrumentation, right? So what kind of instrumentation do you want for your verses? Well, again, there's no hard and fast rules here, but the one main rule here is that you want it to be in lower energy than your choruses, right? So you want to have your big choruses that are the kind of the crescendo that your song is building up to, but you don't really have any build, right? You have no peaks in your song if everything is a peak, right? If everything's all high energy, then nothing is. So it just kind of becomes noise. So you want to have kind of ups and downs. You want to have dynamics. And so you want your verses to tend to be a little bit lower energy. And so you might have really the vocal is really kind of the main. I mean, you always want the vocal to be your main element, but that might be really kind of dominating in your verses. And you just have some more minimalist instrumentation, perhaps. This doesn't mean you can't do cool things in your verses. Definitely you want everything to be cool and interesting. But something I like to tend to do is maybe try to do more interesting production, interesting sound selection in the verses, and then the chorus is just kind of like, that brings you home and catches in your ear, sticks in your mind. But again, chorus is something else. In general, you want to have simpler verses that kind of build an energy, and you also don't typically want to have each verse be exactly the same. You'll probably want to keep the melody the same, as we're going to get to melody in a second, but consider changing up just something subtle, just adding something to each verse so it's not exactly the same. It's not just copy and pasted. Add in something new, like a little sound effect, or you can change up the percussion, or maybe just add in an extra sound subtly. You don't want to change it up too much because you want your listener to feel grounded. They don't want to feel like everything's changing and they don't know where they're at in the song. But in general, you want to keep your verses the same, but have them change over time so that the energy over the course of the whole song, where you're going to have ups and downs on your song, but in general, you want the progression to be up, going up, referring to energy level. So after instrumentation, you then have the melody. You have to write the melody of your verses. And I find that more complex melodies for verses can actually work better. Whereas, again, this is, this comes down to preference. For me, I like to have maybe a simpler melody for the chorus, because I feel like simpler is easier to remember. It's easier to stick in your head. But then the verses, you can kind of get away with more experimentation, more complexity. But in general, you want to follow some kind of motif structure with your melody. So some common like melody structures would be like A, B, A, B. For example, if you're using a 4-line lyric structure, which is very common. So A, B, that means that the first line of your lyrics or the first line of your melody is the same pattern as your third line, and the same thing, the second line of your melody is the same notes, the same melody as your fourth line. Another common one would be like A, B, A, C. Obviously, you can do all kinds of different combinations, but it's good if you have at least some repetition. It's not just changing every single line, because again, that leaves people not feeling grounded if everything's changing so much like that. You need some kind of repetition. Now, I'll also like to vary this. So my verse is like 3 measures, so it's, it repeats 3 times. I might have the A, B, and then it repeats again, A, B, but then the last one before the last repeat before it gets into the chorus or the pre-chorus is I might have it be something completely different, like C, D, C, E or something. So it just adds some more interest. But then that whole melody, that whole verse melody, then will repeat for the next verse. Again, you can change up melodies from verses to verses, but what you typically hear is you'll hear them stay the same, because again, that makes people feel grounded. And as humans, we like familiarity. And that's why songs keep getting simpler and simpler, which there's a downside to that for sure. You're definitely losing something there. But again, every song is different and everyone has different tastes. But keep in mind that in general, it's best if you can keep the same melody pattern from verse to verse. All right, so finally that takes us to the lyric content of your verses. And so again, if we're using the 4-line structure, lines 1 and 2 might be completing a thought that you're wanting to communicate, and then lines 3 and 4 complete the entire sentence. So basically every 4 lines is a sentence, and they might have one overall idea, but you might have like different thoughts inside of it. So to illustrate this, I have my song Hydrazine, which follows this A-B melody structure. And just to give the context of what the song is about, it's about this scientist or chemist that's doing really important work. And so they're all focused on that, but then they've kind of isolated themselves as a result, and they've realized they've lost what really matters, what's more important to them, which is the woman that he's in love with. So this song is kind of about realizing that establishing that chemistry with her is really even more important than the chemistry work he's doing in his lab. And so there's a lot of symbolism, blah, blah, blah. Following up on this complete thought versus sentence. So for example, my one verse, the first 2 lines are, I've lived alone so many days, just tucked away inside. So that's a complete thought. He's talked about he's living alone and he's tucked away inside, not just inside the lab, but inside his own head. Everything's happening internally. He has no connections with other people. Then the next 2 lines, so lines 3 and 4 of this complete melody pattern, he's then, the lyrics then finish the entire kind of sentence, even though these are kind of like 2 sentences, but completes the whole idea, the whole message of this little section, which is just burning time, mixing together the things that don't matter. So then it kind of builds on him being alone. He's all inside and he's doing important things, but now he realizes that he was actually just burning time, just mixing together things that really don't matter. They felt important at the time, but in context with this woman that he's in love with, that he's lost connection with, they don't really matter compared to that. And verse 2 follows the same format. So lines 1 and 2, couldn't see what lay beneath the solution inside. And so again, I'm using lots of symbolism here because, right, solution is a chemistry term, but it's also talking about the answer lies within. And so then the next lines 3 and 4 are, but there you were, the one in front of me all this time. So he thought, right, the answer to fulfillment and happiness was just, diving into his work, diving into the lab, working on his chemistry. But the actual solution was in this person that was there in front of him all this time. And so, of course, the choruses then really communicate the message. But here is the verses telling the story, how he's going from this isolated, alone, solely focused on his work to making a change and realizing that his life wasn't as fulfilled So this is kind of a good pattern to follow, as is kind of having 2 lines at a time to communicate a thought, and then groups of like 4 lyrics communicate an entire idea made up of a couple different thoughts. At least that's the way I like to do it, right? Again, there's no hard and fast rules. You do what works for you. But that's what I've found works. And again, right, these verses are communicating the story over time. Then you have your choruses that emphasize the message. All right, so those are verses, but that's obviously just one part of writing an amazing song. And I've actually broken down, I've looked at what do all the hit songwriters have in common. And I found kind of 9 key elements that they all tend to use to write amazing songs that resonate with a lot of people. And I've assembled these 9 key elements into a handy guide, the hit creation formula, that you can download for free in the description below. Or you can just go to orpheusaudioacademy.com/hit. All right, if you found this video helpful, feel free to drop a like and subscribe for more content like this. And let me know in the comments below, what's your #1 tip for writing amazing verses? All right, with that, have a great day and keep creating.